Well, good evening. Thank you all for being out tonight. I appreciate it very much. My mother-in-law had some physical needs that my wife is trying to take care of tonight, and so that's why she is not here. But we had been out of town for about 4.5 days, and she was able to celebrate her birthday on yesterday, with our twin grandchildren in Knoxville, and get to spend a little time with them and see their first soccer game as 5-year-olds, and so she got to enjoy that, and so we got home last night around a little after 9 o'clock, I guess, and so she is needing to be away this evening, and Kevin was unable to come tonight, and so we're going to pick up where we left off last week. And one of the great things about being around your grandchildren, I'm sure you have a ton of stories you can tell, but Faith and my daughter Rebecca picked up boys after their day at kindergarten yesterday. And they were in the car and they were asking about their classmates, and they said, "Is everybody okay?" And they told her that there was one child that wasn't in school yesterday. And they said, "Well, what happened?" And said, her grandmother, something happened to her grandmother. And they said, "Well, do you remember what happened? Can you tell us?" And one of them said, "Yes, she got stoned." And so you can imagine where your mind goes when a 5-year-old says that someone's grandmother got stoned. And so you could go to, thinking about what part of the country they grow up in, and where the great-grandparents hippies, or, do they get stoned? Or your mind goes to, I'm teaching a class on Thursday nights down at the Graymuir School of Preaching right now on the life of Paul, and we started out last Thursday night talking about how that Stephen was stoned. You could go there. And so they're trying to listen respectively, because this is a little child's grandmother that something's happened to, but inwardly they're just cracking up trying to figure out what in the world they mean by stoned. And it turned out some way their translation of what happens when a person was buried and they put a stone on top where they're buried, it became something happened to grandmother, she got stoned. And so I guess we're talking about life as it progresses and how people can end up being stoned. And I just didn't know that until yesterday afternoon. But it's nice to be able to talk and interact with you. I didn't answer a question well last Wednesday night, and that's what I want to start with tonight. I was asked about the agent that signs, to be a surrogate decision maker, an agent that's appointed to make decisions for someone, and whether or not they could be related to, or maybe I was asked specifically about the agent, what they would do, could they be related to the person? And I was not hearing the question right. Of course, the agent or surrogate decision maker could be a mate, could be a child, whomever you want to designate. Where they don't allow a witness to be to the living will or advance directives is they don't want that to be a person that's related that is going to be perhaps a recipient of benefits from the estate. Now that's where they put a prohibition against a person being a witness. And so it's a person not related by blood or by marriage or adoption and not be entitled to any portion of the estate. That's a witness's role. Can't be a person related. But if I wanted my wife, or if I wanted my son and daughter to know and understand my directives, and I said, "Now I want you all to, stand behind me, something happens, and put these in force. I want you to be my health care agents or surrogate decision makers." Well, that's perfectly fine for that to take place that way. And if you have someone you love and trust and you know who they are and how they represent you, of course you'd want to choose them to fill that role. So I wanted to clarify that answer before we went any further with anything there. Have you thought of any other questions that you'd like to ask someone that gave a poor answer last week?
I'm just glad you answered because I went home and told my husband, I was like, I am so confused.
Yes.
And that was actually going to be my first question to you tonight because I came in and I thought, well, who am I going to? I was like, my 17-year-old daughter?
Yeah, no.
Have
Sure, yeah. And so I just gave a poor answer last week. So I wanted to start there. I got home and I thought, no, wait a minute. And so that's my bad, but thank you. Oh, no problem. Anyone else have any specific questions tonight? Okay. Well, we're going to back up a little bit. Kevin, had asked a couple of, maybe 3 weeks ago, if we could go ahead and talk about advanced directives the prior 2 weeks, which, I've been able to do. But upstream from that is what is known as palliative care as well. If you pick up a textbook, a medical textbook, it will say that hospice is palliative care, but all of hospice, or all of palliative care is not hospice. So there's an aspect of palliative care that I wanted to discuss a little bit tonight. We all have people that we know that get involved in different positions in life and things happen. And it may be a chronic illness, it may be a death by an acute illness, but there are changes that happen. And one of the most impressive things that I remember studying in the Gospels is about when Jesus walked on the water. And prior to that, he had received the news that John the Baptist had been beheaded. And so it's interesting, after feeding the 5,000 and dismissing the crowds, he sends in the midst of all that, he sends his disciples on across the Sea of Galilee. And so they go, and he's still on this side of the sea, and after the crowds are dismissed and everybody's gone, he goes up on a mountaintop, it says, to pray. And I don't know if you've ever thought about the content of his prayer on that night. What was in his mind? Was he praying for the disciples because they were struggling in understanding just who he was as the Messiah? He knows that time is moving on, and he's picked these men, and he's going to entrust them with taking the gospel to every creature and going out and proclaiming the kingdom. But they're having difficulty accepting who he really is as the Messiah. They had their concepts of who the Messiah was going to be. And when Jesus was saying certain things about that role, they were saying, no. And they were really struggling to understand it. And so, they had doubts at times. And he would have to say to them, oh, you have little faith. They struggled with understanding what it was he wanted them to see and understand about his role. So was he praying for them that their faith would increase, that their acceptance of what he was telling them would be broad and deep, and would they, be ready and prepared, to go forth and do what he was trusting them to do? But I also wonder if he was just sharing some of his own hurt and sorrow with his Heavenly Father. Thinking about how John the Baptist's life had ended, knowing where his life was headed. Thinking about the cruelty of humanity and those that rejected what God had in store for them. And was he just expressing some of his grief to God? about the loss of a person he loved dearly. And so I just wonder about the whole content of his prayer. But I am touched by a story that was told of Brother Charles Brewer years ago, preaching at a big area-wide gospel meeting in a convention center down in Chattanooga. And after he had preached that night, he had talked about how Jesus was our great high priest and how he feels everything that we feel. He deals with everything that we have to deal with in our lives. And the story is told that a man walked up to him and got to talking to him and said, you said tonight that Jesus understands everything we go through. And he says, that's right. And the man talked to Brother Brewer for a little bit, and he said, well, Jesus was never married. No, he wasn't. And Jesus never went through a divorce. And he said, no, he did not. And he said, well, then how can he relate to the things we go through in our lives when you say every aspect? And there was a piano over in that convention hall and Brother Brewer pointed to it, and he asked him the question. He said, do you think that every song that has ever been written has been played on that piano? And the man said, well, no, there's no way. He said, well, do you think that every key on that keyboard has been struck? And the man said, well, I assume so, probably even testing it when it was manufactured and made, yes. And he said, well, that's the way it is with our human hearts. Every note that could be struck was struck in the Lord's life like the notes will be struck in your life. And so what is said that Brother Brewer told the man, it may be a different tune, but every note that can be struck will be struck and was struck in Jesus' life. And so therefore he is our great high priest. And he knows what we go through. I speak to people, not every day, but on several days of each week. And they will share their sorrow over someone that they know that has died. Some of those people have died because of choices they've made to abuse substances. There was a report on Fox News this morning about how now that in marijuana, increasingly people that are selling marijuana on the street are cutting substances into the marijuana. And I was trying to explain that to a young patient recently, and he said, oh, it's just a myth. That doesn't happen. And lo and behold, this morning this news is broadcast nationally. And what's happening is that people are getting substances and they think they're buying something like maybe you could imagine in the 1960s. And they're thinking they're just getting marijuana, the product of a plant that's been processed, and that's what they're getting. But they don't realize that they're getting something that has meth cut into it, or that has fentanyl that you're hearing a lot about cut into it. And so these young people can be like a child of two people I know fairly well, really much closer to my brother than me, that takes a substance, is cutting his grandfather's grass, and next thing you know, the grandfather doesn't hear the mower running, and he looks out in the yard, and the mower stopped, and the grandson's on the ground. And he's been exposed to a substance to which he's naive, and he loses his life. But then people talk to me about caring for, and they've quit their jobs in order to care for a parent. And they'll tell me week after week, month after month, about what's happening and how a person's life is changing. And so what I'm trying to say is that when you think about the different processes and different ways that the end of life can come, that God knows. Jesus lived here. His heart was pulled by all of that. He does care. And He knows what it's like to be in those positions. He knows what it's like to lose people that He dearly loved in a personal relationship, like we share in human relationships. But He also loved as the Savior. And so when you think about palliative care, our minds are tempted to go straight to hospice and just think about end-of-life care. But what palliative care is, it's a concept that hasn't been brought over into the United States for that many decades, really, in a formal sense. And it was brought here, and people started to talk about it. And when you think about what you hear on TV, sometimes it's a commercial or sometimes it's an annual event they're having that's broadcast on the news. I don't know how many of you know it, but Alive Hospice is actually, that's here in Nashville, is one of the oldest hospices around. And they do such phenomenal work. But a lot of hospice organizations now are trying to broaden what they do in terms of palliative care. And palliative care has a three-pronged approach. It's a person-centered care. It involves professional care, medically and from a counseling or social worker perspective. And it involves personal choices. And so Senator Bill Frist, along with some younger folks, started a company in Nashville. Now it's been maybe 8 or 9 years ago that they called Aspire Healthcare, and they had a new model that they developed for delivering palliative care to people. And there's some people in town that know about it and others that don't. But Aspire is a company. Eventually it grew into 27 different states, and it was bought out by a large insurance company, and its home quarters are still here in Nashville, but they may be in over 30 states now. And they found a model that works. A lot of people have tried to do this, and it's failed because, the reimbursement's not that great for providing palliative care, so you have to figure out a way to do it to make it successful from a business standpoint while providing a need for people and saving health care dollars. And that's what I spent 2 or 3 years going around talking to several organizations about, and doctors groups, and I would go out and educate them about this. And so palliative care involves not just a patient, a person that's identified as the patient, but it involves the whole family. And you look at that group of people as the unit of care. And what you're trying to do with people is to provide for them the best quality of life they can have. So ideally, if you go to the doctor and you've had a test and they've done a biopsy and they come back and they sit down with you and they tell you that you have some form of cancer, let's say. Ideally, you would be introduced at that moment to a palliative care healthcare provider. And you may not need them that much initially. You might need them in a few months, or you might not need them for a few or more years. But they'd be there to build a relationship with you and just to see you every once in a while, check in with you, see how things are going, see how you're tolerating treatment if you're getting treatment, or see how things are, relatively stable or in remission, or maybe all of a sudden they're progressing. I think most of us have probably known people that have been told you're cancer-free. And people rejoice, and that sounds great. And sometimes people really do live a long time after that. Yes, sir.
The nature and scope of palliative care is rather extensive, and it boils down to what you can afford. That is a real, it's a consideration.
Yes, sir.
And how you pick from that menu of affordability is where the difficulty lies.
Yes, sir. Well, and this is what is really something. the model that Senator Frist developed, the insurance companies were saying, we'll add that to our program and we'll cover the people for it. Because what happened, one of the major insurance companies in the country came in and did a retrospective study, and they found out that after 4.5 months they just picked a sample, and when they did it randomly, and then when they started working with that sample of people, they had been on palliative care for about 4.5 months. And they knew exactly what they, as an insurance company, had paid to Aspire to provide that care. And even paying that, what happened was they reduced hospitalizations in the last 9 months of life from an average of 3.2 hospitalizations and being in the ICU and all these types of interventions. And so you can imagine how expensive that was. They reduced that from 3.2 hospitalizations to in between 0.8 and 1.2 hospitalizations during that same time period. So they cut the cost to the insurance company and to the families, by about 60-some% during that time period. And so even though they were paying a set amount of money to Aspire, and that's why Aspire was successful, because they came up with a brilliant model and they kept robust data about it and they could prove all of this. The reason that they were able to do that was that they would pay a certain amount of money, and they were saving the insurance companies about 80% in cost over the last 9 months of a person's life. And that equaled just thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars. And so there are models for palliative care that a lot of people couldn't afford, or a lot of insurance programs maybe wouldn't even cover. And it's a slowly evolving model, even though it's been approved and said this needs to be done and it needs to be incorporated into care. The reimbursement is just not real great overall. But for an example, if a cancer program, clinic, is large enough and they start a palliative care program, what happens is they hire someone, it's a palliative care doctor, and there's been a pretty good study about this, that what happens is that someone like me who's trained in palliative care, I can sit down and I can take ample time with the patient and their family, that unit. I can listen to what's going on, and I can talk to them about choices and alternatives and what can be done to try to address this symptom or that symptom. And while I'm doing that, the reimbursement that the practice gets, it may not cover my time fully. But I don't end up becoming a hole in that practice, because what happens is that during that same amount of time, the oncologist is maybe able to do 4 new patient intakes. And so in one way it looks like it's a little bit of a loss, but another way, with the savings that are taking place and the more people that are being served, it ends up wiping out that loss on the balance sheet and actually becoming, with the whole picture, becoming more of a profit for the practice. And so it's, but a lot of people just don't have that model and don't have it yet, because there have been a lot of companies that have tried to provide palliative care, and it was costly and it was not cost effective, and then they've had to close their doors about it. And you also have to be very careful. Let's say if you're a hospice organization and you're starting that palliative care, you can't do that just so you'll have that as a feeder, to end-of-life care. That's not ethical to do that. And so there are a lot of challenges and obstacles still to palliative care. You're absolutely right. But if it's done right, and if it can be done, it provides a lot of good help for people. And so, what you can do, you can maximize the expertise of a physician and healthcare practitioners and provide quality concurrent palliative care across the disease trajectory. Sometimes symptoms are caused by treatments. And if they're caused by treatments, well then, Maybe there are ways that you can help a person maintain some of their physical abilities through physical therapy or other interventions. It may be that you can, and when you are on palliative care, it's different than being in hospice. You don't have to revoke a lot of the other type of curative care. You can have curative care while you're on palliative care. And so you're having the curative care and you're having some nausea and vomiting, well, they can treat that and follow that with you. A disease is progressing and you're losing your ability to breathe. Well, there can be treatments for that to help you with that. And the neat thing that Senator Frist and those bright young minds that were working with him developed was that, these people were getting, for the insurance company, Aspire wasn't paid by the people. Aspire was paid by the insurance companies. And so Aspire said, we'll see these people on average 1.8 times a month. And we'll continue to provide their care. And so when they need to be seen 4 times a month, we'll see them 4 times a month. When they get to the point they need to be seen 6 times a month, we'll see them 6 times a month. And so in doing that, there was a lot of symptom management, a lot of listening, and a lot of answering questions. One of the most helpful things I've ever seen in my adult life in working with people just as a minister, as someone in their family was progressing toward the end of life, was how an organization like hospice can say to the people, now this is what you expect to see next. This is what will likely follow this stage of their illness. When we had our twins, I would go and sit down with a gentleman who has his PhD in childhood development, and I would talk to him and I'd say, here's what Andrew and Rebecca are doing now, and he said, here's what they're going to do next. And here's what you need to prepare yourself to do, and here's what you're going to have to deal with as a father. And it was so helpful to me to have that type of counsel from him. And the same thing can be true in our lives, when we face illnesses. But then what we've talked about in here is respecting people's personal choices for their health care. And that's why we've talked about the directives and thinking about processes and all. One of the things that's been most challenging for me, and I'm just going to be open with you about this, is that when I went into this and got trained in it, I really believe in the holistic model. And for me, that is thinking about what that means in terms of their spiritual well-being as well. And so I want to talk to people about that. And there's some practices that don't want you to talk to them about that. But I think it's important for the whole person to be cared for. You have the psychological, emotional dimension, you have the physical dimension, but people need the spiritual dimension. At Vanderbilt, I was exposed to a lady that I took to lunch. And I was fascinated by what she's doing. She had been hired by the Catholic Church diocese I don't know how big the diocese was here in Nashville, but she was what was called a parish nurse. And so as that parish nurse, she was going out and providing care for Catholic Church members in their home and helping them through transitions like this. And I think that'd be a wonderful ministry, for churches to do that. But what you want to do is try to help people have a better quality of life if they're having pain. We're hearing a lot of bad stuff about pain management, but there comes a time when you may want pain management. If I'm writhing on the floor with a kidney stone that's stuck and I'm throwing up and everything, and they can give me something to knock that pain off, Edge, I'm wide open to that. If you're going to cut inside my hip and you're going to do a total hip replacement and there's going to be some pain that follows that surgery, there's an appropriate way to manage that pain, appropriate role for pain management. But then there's the other side of it where it's gotten out of control. I've just finished and just started to submit an article I've written about the opioid crisis and the fact that it's more than facts and figures. Because we're hearing facts and figures on the news every day. And we're hearing about now over the last year, more than likely in the United States alone, over 100,000 deaths from opioid overdoses. That's a lot in a year's time. Super Bowl's coming up this Monday night. SoFi Stadium in the area near Los Angeles will seat, I think it's 70,240 people. And they can accommodate, by doing some standing room only and different things, they can accommodate 100,000 people in that stadium. 100,000 people. We're going to see that if we watch the game next Monday night on TV. Can you imagine if all those people suddenly were just taken away and they were gone? Over 100,000 people died of opioid overdoses over the course of a year. There's a book called Proofiness. It's written by some statisticians, and they were talking about how you'll turn on the news or your TV on New Year's Eve, and it'll say, that there's estimated 1 million or 2 million people in Times Square tonight to watch the ball drop. And they've done studies, and they've looked at the area that's technically Times Square, and if you put 6 people shoulder to shoulder in a meter by meter square, and you don't put any separation between that square with the next square with 6 people shoulder to shoulder in it, their estimate is that if you pack people in there that tightly in Times Square, that you likely would only have about 100,000 people there, not 1 million or 2 million people there. Now you think about that. What if all those people were gone all of a sudden? We were there years ago, and after the ball had dropped, we walked into Burger King to get a cup of hot chocolate, and all of a sudden someone yelled, "He's got a gun!" And there was 6 or 7 guys that ran off the street, and there was one guy following him in, and he did have a gun. And we dove behind the counter, and they were saying, "You can't come back here. This is where our cash register are." And he said, "Yes, we can." Off we went. But I mean, the police were on top of that in nothing flat and got the guy arrested and got the gun away, and everything turned out fine. But can you imagine 100,000 people in there to watch the ball drop all of a sudden if they were just all gone? And that's what happened in the last year with opioid overdoses. And so there's just a lot of hurt, and so I could throw a lot of different statistics out to you. That a lot of what's going on with the opioid crisis is a result of not healthy management of pain in people that are really sick. And so palliative care is trying to increase what we've talked about the last couple of weeks, advanced care planning, reduce the length of hospital stays, decrease recurrent hospital admissions. When you think about it, we live in the South. A lot of you have probably been to funeral visitations in people's homes, and maybe you can remember years ago when their bodies were just kept, and the caskets were kept in the house, and people would sit up with them until the time came for a funeral service, and then they're taken somewhere and they were died. Even now, when they do studies, something like 83% of the people say they would like to die at home. And you know what? It's about just the opposite of that. And it's closer to 80% or so that end up dying in the ICUs in the hospitals or in a facility of some sort and not at home. So when we talk about are you ready, one way is, what do you really want? The surprise question that doctors, healthcare providers, if they're trained in palliative care, are taught to ask. They're taught to ask when they're dealing and trying to help someone who's chronically ill, would you be surprised if something happened to this person within the next 6 months? And if they look and they say no, and they, we're watching a loved one change slowly. And there'll come a time when her doctor might say, I wouldn't be surprised if something happened in the next 6 months. And none of us are God. None of us can see all of that on our own. But if you ask yourself that question and the answer is no, then it's a really good time to say, okay, now, if we've been putting things off, are we going to make these decisions? What do we need to wrap up? What loose ends are that need to be tied? And so that's where palliative care can play a role. And there are a lot of different things we could talk about palliative care, but what you need to know, and this is one of the things I thought was wonderful about what Senator Frist and them developed, we would have meetings in the morning, and we would try to decide, we would share with each other what interventions maybe could be made that we weren't making with someone. Try to help them have a better quality of life. Any of you familiar with the term Tumor Board? When you work in the field of cancer and you are seeing patients in the hospital, a lot of those hospitals are going to have what they call tumor boards because there's some really challenging things that happen. So a group of doctors and radiologists and different people sit down early one morning and someone will come in and they'll make a presentation about a particular person and their case and what kind of mutations they found and how extensive something is, and whether or not, the question is, should these people be treated? Should they be given treatment? Or if they are given treatment, what's going to work best for them? And how can we answer their questions, and how can we make this the most effective approach for them? And it's fascinating to watch all these brilliant minds around that table talking about that and trying to decide, okay, what's this mean? It's just like I told you about Atul Gawande, in his writing that book, Being Mortal. I mean, his dad was a urologist and was doing surgery and playing tennis and active member of the Rotary Club. His mother, I think, maybe was a primary care physician. Dr. Gawande is a licensed medical doctor. But when the three of them were told what was going on with their dad, it was so unique that when they sat down with two different specialists and they got two different bits of advice, one said, we've got to go full force now, we've got to treat this now, and the other one said, no, we can watch and wait. And they're sitting there as three physicians and they're thinking, what do we do? And so a lot of this is just really challenging, and it's not easy necessarily to address and to deal with it all. We typically think about the physical aspects of care. But, when things happen in a person's life, I don't know what you would say if someone said, how do you not want to die? Well, I've never wanted this to happen, I don't want to burn to death. I don't want to be in a bad motor vehicle accident. I don't want to have that type of illness, Years ago, I'd visit people in the hospital and as a minister, and they would tell me that they had an injection in their eye, and I would just think, no, who wants that? And now, after having COVID and having some vascular changes in my eye, I don't know how many injections I've had in both eyes over the last 2 years. And so there may be some things that you just don't want, but there may be some things that come your way. And so how do you prepare for that? And how do you make those needs known? And so I just wanted to briefly introduce, and we don't need to do this from a textbook type approach, but there are goals of care that you have, but they need to be guided by what your choice is. Not just what I think should be done, or not what just this interdisciplinary team that sits down and meets, that has nurses and social workers and a chaplain and doctors and, in together and taking in reports and information from other tests and things that have been done, trying to decide what the best thing is to do. The main thing that matters is what is the person's goal of care. And how do you really be honest with someone about the disease process? I had a man, and I could probably drive you straight to his house without any directions, even though it's been a few years since I was going to see him. Had such advanced cancer that he would just hemorrhage and bleed. And I couldn't understand initially why. He wanted to fight like that, to live, because it was not curable. But if someone offered him, well, here's another trial, boom, he'd grab it, because he was hoping. And what I was having to do, I was having to talk to his wife, and I was having to say, no, this is going to continue to happen. And so you need to go out and buy some really dark towels, so that when he gets so sick that he's bleeding again, you can absorb that. And the reason why he wanted to live like he wanted to live, he was trying to raise a grandchild, preschool age. And I said it'll help that preschool age grandchild not to be as upset by what they're seeing. Because the likelihood was that this gentleman was going to hemorrhage to death. One time they weren't going to be able to stop it. But I had to respect, and I did respect, his wishes. Because he wanted to do everything he could to be there to love that grandchild and raise that grandchild. And so you have to hear where people are. And it's not just a textbook type of thing. And you have to listen. But oh, how I know that we need to incorporate the spiritual care into this dimension. And it's not just, oh, you're a member of this faith, let me get someone of that faith to come and visit you. From my perspective, I'd like to be able to sit down and say, okay, now, how are you with the Lord? Are you ready that way? And if someone says, no, but I'd really love to talk about it, I'd love to be able to listen to their hearts and to be able to do that openly and talk to them and answer their questions and help them in every way that we could. Well, our time's up. Do y'all have any questions or anything, observations you wanted to make tonight?
I'd like to make a comment. We had hospice care in Norman.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And that is wonderful. When you get to the point where you're Medicare age or you have Medicare insurance, depending on even at a younger age, if it's determined, that hospice care is a benefit that many people have just earned through their life with the taxes they paid, and it's provided. And when it's done well, there are studies that show that it actually elongates. It doesn't hasten a death. It elongates life if it's started early enough and it's provided in a good way. And it's just amazing to me. I was involved with a family, 4 adult children, all of them bright, well-educated from some of the most well-known private institutions in this country. And then when they saw how one of their parents was cared for just in the last 24, 36 hours of life after being referred late, they said, oh, if we'd understood, we'd have gotten this from our parent, so much earlier. Any other questions or observations? Thank you, Sam, for sharing that. Thank y'all. Y'all have a good night, and I appreciate you being here.